Well, David, you're very welcome to Counterpoint. Looking for important information amongst the dissenters, and you're certainly a dissenter. Although I think that's going to change as matters unfold. You've just issued a new book, which I've just recently studied because it's brand new, which is called. I just want to make sure I have the title absolutely right: COVID-19: Psychological Operations and the War on Technology. You're a professor of international relations, so presumably that means that you study terrorism and psychological operations and all of that for a living. You're not a spring chicken, which means you've done this for quite some time. You have you have a follow up book coming out in June, which is called Wall Street, the Nazis, and the Crimes of the Deep State. Well, you're very welcome to Counterpoint, David. What an introduction! So, well, thanks, David. Look, I've studied your book, glued to it for several days, as I said to you before we recorded this interview. Some of it is absolutely fascinating. You're coming at the whole thing from an academic professional background, given what I've just said about what you do, what you study, and you're reaching deductions as well towards the back end of the book, which we'll get into. But I'd just like to start with a little bit from the top, if I could. I just want to go straight into what I think is very interesting. Well, I think it's very interesting. Now, you take it and run with it whichever way you want to, David, right? But let me just kick it off. This is on page 94 of your book. Really, you're getting straight into the kind of soft explanation, which is the idea that a lot of this is just happenstance, that it was commercial motives, that just all sort of clicked together and created everything we've gone through over a 3-year period. You've kind of nailed that shut pretty dramatically, quoting various other studies that have been done ahead of yours, as you should do. And I know you've taken 3.5 years to get to where you've got to. But what fascinated me really was at the summary of that, where you're basically saying, look, these things weren't happenstance. Let me just read you a little bit of what you wrote, and then you can let you run with it. You said, in reality, COVID-19 operation represents a premeditated, meticulously and maliciously orchestrated attack on the minds and bodies of the public that was enacted in a coordinated fashion by governments around the world. And you're quoting a source there with regards to that. You're saying millions of lives have been lost, and not due to a virus, but due to COVID-19 government policies and medical countermeasures. You're quoting Kingston there. You go on and say the diabolical actions taken were not mere accidents or mistakes. They were crimes, including preventing young children from reaching crucial developmental milestones, forcing hospital patients to die alone without saying goodbye to their families, and pushing millions of people into poverty and starvation. You go on, you're quoting Gerish at this stage, and he says, what we are facing is calculated, and it's a mistake to call it madness because it's very precise. It is very calculated. We need to understand that in order to be able to deal with what we're facing, says Scott, realizing that there are real perpetrators from within our own governments and external parties wishing to do us harm. Now, to cover it off as the cherry on the icing, you then quote from 2020, a study in July 2020, which is only 3 or 4 months into the so-called pandemic, which is straight from the Department of Health and Social Care in the UK, their equivalent of the Central Statistics Office, which is the Office for National Statistics, the government's Actuaries Department, and the Home Office. And this is the quotation. When morbidity is taken into account, the report states on page 2, the estimates for the health impacts from lockdown and lockdown-induced recession are greater in terms of quality-adjusted life years than the direct COVID-19 deaths, and you quote figure 1 of the report. In other words, you say the UK government knew that lockdowns would prove more harmful than COVID-19, yet it kept the population under continual lockdown until July the 19th, 2021. And I'm asking you to talk about that because we had the longest lockdown in Ireland and Europe. Can you just run from there, David, and explain how you've come to that conclusion?
It's very interesting that you've chosen that passage as the starting point, because that precise contention I take pains to underscore again and again and again in the book, that there is nothing whatsoever that was accidental about what happened in 2020 and 2021. When you do the research, as I have done, it becomes painstakingly clear that much of this was planned in great detail in a manner which would have taken many years. I'm thinking probably at least a couple of decades, looking at the relevant military intelligence literature. And that all of this was done by design as a psychological operation waged against the public, whose intent was to disorient and demoralize and debilitate the population, thereby rendering it less able to resist the intended transition from liberal democracy to global technocracy. So we can get into those terms a bit later. But in terms of the element of intent, the passage that you just quoted, straight from UK government documents, is essentially a direct admission that it knew that in terms of quality adjusted life years, the implications of locking down, in inverted commas, would be catastrophic. Now, if the government had come out and said these policies are essentially designed in such a way that they will cost the lives of X number of people, there would have been tremendous pushback against this. But instead, it was framed in a way that had to do with saving lives. And again, I dig down into that government document that you've just cited. And when you actually look at the figures that they provide and the sources that they provide, none of it actually ties together. None of it stacks up. It's all very much in the vein of the Neil Ferguson 510,000 projected deaths forecast, which is nothing but a forecast.
And Ferguson had a spectacularly poor record in the past in terms of estimations around so-called pandemics.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, this was not the first time that Ferguson has engaged in these practices. You can take it all the way back to foot and mouth, I think, in 2001. And there are at least 5 or 6 different incidents where he's produced scandalously inflated forecasts, which, of course, lend themselves to the enactment of particular policies. So this is deeply troubling when you can find it in the government's own documentation that it knew full well in 2020 what the implications of this would be in terms of quality adjusted life years. And it went ahead and it did it anyway. And in addition to all of the harms that you read out from page 94 there of the book, that doesn't even touch the violation of the Nuremberg Code when it comes to the coerced injections of a reported 5.55 billion people. So we're looking here at crimes on an almost unimaginable scale, which have been perpetrated transnationally.
Can I pause you there, David? One of the things that you've done, I know you've done extensive reporting on it in your book, was you ran a parallel between psychological torture techniques, well known and documented, and you've juxtapositioned that into what we all went through over the. Can you walk us through that and what your findings there were?
Yeah, I mean, this is just one aspect of the psychological operation. So, I mean, the middle 6 chapters of the book each get into one kind of key aspect of the psychological warfare. And this is only volume 1 of 2. So I'll preface this by saying that the psychological torture aspect is just one small aspect of the bigger picture. Nevertheless, when you go back and you look at, for example, the MK Ultra mind control documents from the 1950s and early 1960s, you can see then that they were working on most effective techniques of torturing. They called it interrogating a victim to try and bend that person's will to their control. Now, when the ordinary person thinks about torture, the image which tends to come to mind is, let's say, medieval times and somebody being put on the rack and a physical form of torture. However, it's been known really since ancient Roman times that physical forms of torture are highly ineffective in terms of getting a victim to divulge reliable information or to recant or confess to something in any earnest sense. In actual fact, those kinds of means of torture are known to produce unreliable information. And it's interesting that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was tortured in the early years of the War on Terror. And there are something like 100, 200 references to his confessions made under torture in the 9/11 Commission report. So if anything, physical torture is used to produce unreliable information. So what we need to understand is that the most effective forms of torture are in fact psychological forms of torture. And this is what the MKUltra program revealed in the mid-20th century. And there are various means through which this can be done. One is the induction of chronic stress. And I cite Dennis Rancourt's work in my book because he's done the most thorough examination of all-cause mortality data during the COVID era, and in particular for the United States, where the best available data is available. And his detailed analysis concludes that essentially chronic stress must have been a factor in the mortality rates witnessed in the United States. In addition, we're looking at techniques which involve, for example, self-inflicted pain coupled with sensory deprivation. Now, one of the troubling things here has to do with Guantanamo Bay. So in that chapter 3, I trace the continuities between some of the experiments which were done as part of the MKUltra programming, which involved, for example, placing victims in conditions of sensory deprivation with, for example, industrial strength earmuffs or hands in thick padding, blindfolds, this kind of thing. And when you look at the photographs from 2002 at Guantanamo Bay, you can see quite clearly that all of those techniques are being applied to the inmates there. So we know that there is a definite continuity between MKUltra and what was going on at Guantanamo Bay. Now, where it gets really disturbing is that there are other photos from Guantanamo Bay where the inmates don't have all of those things on, but they are all there wearing blue surgical face masks. So we know that Guantanamo Bay is a torture facility. We know that it has connections with MKUltra. I'm not aware of any other time before 2020 when the wearing of these blue surgical masks was made compulsory for anyone. I mean, okay, you can talk about surgeons perhaps, but that's a different context. Even the SARS outbreak in 2003, I don't think it was compulsory for East Asians to wear the masks. I mean, they did in their numbers, which is an interesting sociological phenomenon in and of itself. But it suggests quite strongly to me that there is something very dark about the wearing of face masks.
Yeah, because there's no scientific proof that they have any effect. One of the people that you quote, I decided to dive into a bit because I thought it was very interesting. You mentioned Staunton and his work on the 10 steps towards eventually you end up, totalitarianism and genocide. Now, I know we're not at that point, but you make the point that we've actually gone through four of those steps so far. You might just walk us through that, because what I'm trying to do here is to give people the framework that you were applying. I know it's hard to do it because it's quite a long book, but get a sense of the framework you're applying to what was enacted upon us over a period of 3 years.
Right, and in this sense, the COVID-19 psychological operations and the War for Technocracy book goes hand in hand with the next book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, because what both of them are doing is to make the case that what's being instigated here is a multi-year program designed to gradually collapse liberal democracy and institute a novel form of totalitarianism, which is biodigital technocracy. Now, this is not something which happens overnight. You don't suddenly wake up one day and find yourself in the worst depths of totalitarianism. For example, the worst crimes of Nazi Germany didn't take place in 1933. They took place in the latter years of the Third Reich. So the broader picture that I'm trying to sketch is that, in my opinion, there are strong and non-accidental continuities between the political economy of 1930s Germany in the pre-war years and the political economy of the West today. We see that played out in many ways, but just to come back to Stanton's 10 stages of genocide, this is something that I conclude chapter 7 of the book with, and that chapter is all about mechanisms of social division, essentially, and an increasingly elaborate number of ways of creating ostracization, stigmatization, discrimination, outright vaccine apartheid in 2021. And all of these methods were used to essentially divide society against itself. And what they've done is to put dissidents essentially in a particular camp through these various techniques, which involve, for example, certain forms of naming and shaming and hate speech. You know, the anti-vaxxers, the conspiracy theorists, the far right, blah blah blah. You know, all of these terms are just propaganda terms that are being used to demonize those of us who can see what's going on and are willing to speak out. So when you look at it in those terms, it seems to me that the first 4 stages of Stanton's 10 stages were in fact satisfied in 2020, 2021. And that's something that you have to pay serious attention to. You know, Stanton's 10 stages of genocide, they were first formulated in the 1980s, but they came to prominence in 1996, 2 years after the Rwandan genocide. And at that time, Stanton had influence with the UN. And you know, this is important work that he's done, because the whole point of it is to be able to identify warning signs and see what might be coming in the future and prevent it. So if readers are interested in this, check out chapter 7 of the book, see if you agree that what I argue there corresponds to the first 4 stages of Stanton's 10 stages. I think.
Well, let me just help listeners about that. You're saying, so step 1 is classification, so it's kind of them and us. Second step is symbolization, so which we had with wearing of the masks and the 2 meters and all of that kind of stuff. Then discrimination, restricted rights. We've hate speech bills coming, and they're attempting them in Ireland, all interconnected. In my opinion, it's not something I've said before. And step 4 is basically dehumanization, basically to reduce the humanity or perceived humanity of the subgroup, those especially the dissenters that are standing up with the counter narrative. And then we move on from there through organizations against them, polarization, preparation, persecution, and the final stage is extermination, and the very last stage is denial. So I thought it was very well put. One of the things that really can I just before I ask the next question, I think it might be helpful to just get through the backstory. I mean, my own journey here, it took me 3.5 years of immersing myself in this before I finally began to accept what I was seeing, because I was looking at the big lie. You mentioned Arendt in that regard. Hitler talked about the big lie in Mein Kampf. Can you just talk us about the big lie? Because we seem to have a problem in just getting our heads around it, because we only engage in small lies ourselves. So we find the big lie almost impossible to contemplate.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most powerful aspects of the psychological operation. I devote the whole of chapter 6 to this concept. As you rightly say, and Hitler writes about this in Mein Kampf, for the ordinary man or woman on the street, they can imagine telling lies of a certain scale, but telling lies which would just seem absolutely preposterous is cognitively unimaginable to them. So, for example, the idea that the entire pandemic could have been faked. Now, I provide very extensive evidence for that in chapter 4 and chapter 6 of the book. It was faked. There's no doubt about that when you actually take the time to do the research. But that proposition for most people is too much right there. And they switch off and they blank out and they can't process it. And cognitive dissonance comes into play, which is where ideas which which simply can't be integrated into the everyday experience of the ordinary person, are suppressed, blanked out, perhaps ridiculed. And this is one of the problems that many of us have found in the last few years, is that rational evidence-based communication is actually impossible with many people. You can show them all of the facts you like, you can show them the relevant parts of official reports, you can show them all of the data, you can show them the kind of low case fatality and infection fatality rates and all the rest of it. And for many people, unfortunately, it makes no difference whatsoever because they've been got by the big lie. So if enough governments and mainstream media outlets all run with the same narrative, that has an extremely powerful effect. It creates a majority opinion in society which is aligned to power. And because of the kind of herd psychology behind it, most people feel safe staying with the herd, so they won't challenge those narratives. And this is a huge problem that we have now, because not only are these narratives very powerful, they're also very dark and very nefarious.
And when just if I could just pause you there, just to make one comment here, we've had a significant problem here in Ireland with the state broadcaster RTE, which is in a complete mess ever since. Not that it was related to COVID; it just coincided with immediately after it. It's now subject to a strategic review on its funding, and it's just a mess, and a management mess as well, just a colossal mess. And poured through the newspapers and dominated the media here. But you've like, given what you've just said, what I find very interesting, because I've RT written opposite something you've written here on page 115 when you're talking about fear and threat. If I could just read this to you, what you're saying is a pandemic is a powerful fear concept, yet there is no credible evidence of a viral pandemic in 2020. That COVID-19 does not meet any credible pre-2009 definition of a pandemic. That was the change the WHO made in 2009 to take away fatality, and anything could be called a pandemic. You go on and say, and attempts to present COVID-19 as a new Spanish flu, and that's bogus. You said the exaggerated threat of COVID-19 was a function of military-grade propaganda emanating from governments and the media, involving a barrage of terrifying images, messages, and alert levels in inverted commas. The BBC, and I would say to any Irish viewer, swap in here RTE, played a particularly culpable role in spreading fear. Death statistics were manipulated. Propaganda about hospitals being overwhelmed by COVID-19 admissions camouflaged a sinister attack on public health. The primary use of face masks and PCR tests was to spread fear. That's very blunt stuff.
But it's all true. It's all true. And that kind of comes in the kind of summary or abstract of the chapter. That's an extremely long chapter, and every single one of those points is explained and argued for at great length, involving hundreds of references to back up all the claims made. So, as hard-hitting as that may sound, it's all properly supported by evidence and properly referenced. Now, in terms of the media, I mean, it's not just RTE and the BBC; it's the entire mainstream media all across the world, as far as I can tell. We're all engaged in this, and it's no wonder now that public trust in the media is at an all-time low. It deserves to be, because, again, let's go back to 9/11 and the war on terror. A lot of the fear there about terrorism and the measures that were justified based on that fear would not have been possible without the media constantly churning out messages of fear and terror. In reality, as one academic, John Muller, showed, the reality of being killed by a terrorist in the West is lower than being struck by lightning. That's the statistical reality. But nevertheless, we've spent the last 20 years being terrorized by the idea that we might be attacked at any minute by terrorists. Now, that just went into overdrive in 2020, when there was absolutely no escape from inflated statistics and terrifying looking images and footage of people allegedly just falling dead on the street in China and Ecuador and elsewhere. The media has a particularly culpable role in all of this, because it's all extremely dark. And again, the idea of using fear and trauma to render the mind more susceptible to propaganda and programming. Once more, this all goes back to the MK Ultra program, at least. When you understand that these techniques, which originally were developed for use against individuals in an experimental setting, are now essentially being rolled out against entire societies.
So to be clear then, David, what you're suggesting, just the logic of it, if I just want to put this to you, is that all of this was was run with military grade precision. I mean, the connections with the platforms, the platforming of people, the delicensing of doctors, none of that is by happenstance. That there is an organization, there's an organized event going on here that has deep roots, and it unfolded using the most modern of psychological omni-war technique. You call it omni-war, war on different levels, for an agenda that still is unfolding, which seems to be going in the direction of trying to create a global technocratic administration, for reasons that we can explore a little bit later. But
Yeah. So just on that, a lot of people might ask, well, how on earth is it possible to achieve such extraordinary levels of coordination? Nothing like this could ever have been planned on this kind of scale, etc., etc. Now, there's 2 points to make there. First of all, any multinational corporation, it's going to be the case that the average employee does not know what is happening at the top boardroom levels. So take, I don't know, PricewaterhouseCoopers, which operates transnationally. The lower level employees get on and do their jobs. The bigger agendas at the very top will not be known even to them, even as they are helping to implement those agendas. But the more important point has to do with what I call the transnational deep state, which has been in incubation since at least the late 1940s. And that is fundamentally the apparatus which provides the coordination here. Now, of course, it's done all it can to remain hidden over the decades. It's very easy to dismiss this kind of idea as some kind of far right conspiracy theory or something like that. Certainly, that's not my politics. And the point that I would make to your viewers and listeners is, if you read my next book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State is right there in the title. For me, it is a valid analytical category, and it's a real existing entity that can be traced all the way back, as I say, to at least the late 1940s. It uses techniques borrowed from the Nazis. It was responsible, for example, for Operation Gladio, false flag terrorism, the strategy of tension, etc., in the 1970s and the 1980s, which were then expanded globally through the global terror wars after 9/11. All of this can be traced. So once you understand that there has been this deliberate apparatus operating behind the scenes for many decades, how all of this was possible in 2020 suddenly starts to slide into view.
I'm not challenging anything you've said, by the way, in case you think I am, because I started my talk in Cork recently with the Eisenhower warning of 19 in the late 50s, yeah, and then Kennedy's assassination just after that, and that's when critical thinkers suddenly then became conspiracy theorists, and we have the protocol paper that came out from the CIA at the time. I mean, all of this sounds. Can I just ask? Because I couldn't face this myself when I started to get into it. I just found it disbelievable. I said, "This is too big. I mean, how could this happen?" And the more research you do on it, the more it becomes obvious. But your own journey there, David. You wrote a peer-reviewed paper in 2016. I think your light bulb moment was much earlier than mine. It was in and around that period. Can you just walk us through that? I mean, you didn't just arrive with these in your head. Can you just to help the viewers and listeners to kind of follow you, look over your shoulders as you took the steps?
Yeah, I mean, I was what's sometimes called a normie myself until December 2016. I wasn't aware of any of this. I was teaching US foreign policy at the time. And one evening I was reflecting on the continuities and similarities between the Vietnam War and the war in Afghanistan. Both very long wars, both very costly wars, involving kind of PTSD and many other parallels besides. And as I was mulling along these kinds of considerations, I thought, well, the war in Vietnam, the significant escalation there took place after 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which has since been shown to have been fake, made up, a false flag operation. And that's essentially what really escalated that Vietnam War. And I thought, well, the war in Afghanistan, that went back to 9/11. So that couldn't possibly have been a false flag operation as well, could it? Because all of the other parallels are holding. So I thought, no, surely not. That's just conspiracy theory, right? So for the first time, I took a serious look at some of the videos and some of the evidence relating to the events of 9/11. And to my horror, I realized within 1 hour that anybody with a shred of intellectual integrity and even just a basic grasp of physics and vectors can look at the way those buildings were destroyed on the 11th of September 2001 and understand that it wasn't aeroplanes.
I think the shock for most people there is when they're asked how many towers fell. And nearly everybody will say 2. But it wasn't 2, there was 3.
Yeah. It's absolutely shocking, actually. So from that point, I realized, that the significance of this can't be overstated, because if that was a false flag operation, and the evidence is absolutely abundant that it was.
And that then gave rise to, there was the physical war on terror, but it also gave rise to a massive increase in surveillance and law in the United States, which was then mimicked throughout the world, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So it was used to legitimize not only imperialist wars of aggression by the US and its allies all across the world, but it was also used at home to bring in all kinds of new levels of security and surveillance and methods of social control at home. So essentially, it paved the way for 2 decades of gradually escalating tyranny. So the thing that shocks me about this is that, given how obvious the evidence is and how irrefutable and how clear it is, my own profession, academia, simply refuses to look at it. And this came as a great shock to me. So I did the responsible thing as an academic. I published some of that evidence in a mainstream peer-reviewed journal article, and I asked, why is it that academia refuses to look at this evidence? And I posited some suggestions as well. And I was naive enough at the time to think that this really should prompt responsible academics to now engage with the evidence. If they haven't seen it before, now it's there in a credible peer-reviewed form, and they have an obligation intellectually to look at it and to respond. And to my horror, here we are 4 years later, and the entire academic community has still not
You might find little comfort in this, but I was years later waking up. But my waking up was literally the month after Italy went into lockdown. I managed to write a pretty substantial piece in one of the newspapers here, basically saying a number of things, but basically saying that this money printing is qualitatively different from anything that's ever happened before, and it's going to create inflation. And for the next, the inflation rate took off in October 2020. Not one single economic professor, not one single economic academic, not one single economic commentator in the newspapers said anything about inflation coming. And the lockout I found in the newspapers and the media was so high that I put 4 different radio campaigns into News Talk, a national radio station here, to warn people that this is going to create inflation. And when the inflation, became quite evident, the central banks, led by the Fed, in America, and mimicked by the ECB and by the Irish Central Bank, said, "Oh, it's transitory." And I said, transitory inflation is not a concept in economics. It's inflation. It's inflation. You call it what it is. And of course, I knew then that they were telling porkies. It's not just that they did. These people are a lot smarter than I am. They knew inflation was coming. They knew it was going to be inflationary. They just didn't want us to know that. And then finally the following year, 2022, they said, "Oh, we're going to have to do something about the inflation that they themselves created." And where were all the academics? there was none. Everybody was keeping their heads down. Everybody. But they knew it was going to be inflationary as well, but they weren't prepared to say it.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not only the silences over very clear issues like this. I mean, if you read the BlackRock report from August 2019, around the time of the meeting at Jackson Hole, where this major decision was evidently made to refashion the entire international and monetary financial system. In that report, it talks about the inflationary effects. It was known before 2020 that this would happen, but you're right. Academia doesn't look at these things, and worse, in my opinion, it is entirely complicit in helping along some of the very worst measures. So if you need more efficient algorithms to help censor information on social media, it's easy to find academics who have published papers helping to promote those kinds of algorithms. Other academics wrote legal justifications for mandatory vaccination. In other words, all of the worst elements you can find academic papers arguing in support for. But when it comes to these really significant areas that are harming the public in all manner of ways, and through what I call the omni-war, i.e. A war that's being waged across every conceivable domain of life, invisibly as far as possible. When it comes to these very harmful measures, unfortunately, the profession has almost nothing to say.
You look, just take academia across the board. In Ireland, we had 19,000 people regulated by the Irish Medical Council. A dozen of them stood up, about a dozen. And those that did were close to retirement.
Yep.
Everybody else kept their heads down. We had it with the economic profession here. And then when you look at the parallels then, and I know your book doesn't get into it, but the parallels in the UN IPCC report on climate change are the same thing. It's Mike Yaden said it. I couldn't find the science, so I followed the money, and then I found the science. I mean, academia seems to be hooked into the flow of funds to produce the reports that the centre wants, rather than actually engage in truth finding. Is that too harsh?
Well, it's not just academia. In my next book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, I point really across all professions, and all of them have completely failed, as far as I can see, since 2020. So in academia, we have a profession which is supposed to be about the fearless pursuit of the truth, which is doing all it can to cover up certain truths. The medical profession should be about first do no harm and informed consent. And those two principles went out the window in 2020. The journalism profession, the idea of the fourth estate and the media holding power to account, all of that's gone. The term prostitutes is now often applied to the mainstream media. They just write what they're told. The political left has completely failed to stand up for the working class and was largely on board with all of the measures and all of the tyranny. The churches very quickly abandoned the teachings of Scripture, were quick to close their doors. The idea of helping the sick and tending to lepers and so on. No, we all have to socially distance and wear masks. And Justin Welby in this country was saying, Jesus would have got vaccinated. So actually, the scale of the civilizational crisis that we're now in is gigantic, because all of the professions failed. And again, it's very similar, actually, to what happened after 1933 in Nazi Germany. It's a similar on a global scale, but the key concept behind it is what was called Gleichschaltung back then, which translates roughly as the production of ideological conformity. And all of the professions have fallen into line. And again, the way of making sure that they stay in line is simply to fire anyone.
Do you think that the impulse behind all this, the organisation, the thinking, the planning, that they've made a mistake now because they're revealed to us, whereas they were well hidden before? That this is, we can see them. I mean, we had the inbound documentation from the World Health Organization, which quite clearly is setting up a global technocracy. I mean, it's black and white. The 49 Republican senators have revolted on it and said this is a breach of US sovereignty. The UK government is saying the same thing, but using more polite language, saying, you can't have our vaccines, but because it's not in the British national interest, they're talking, and they're using the word sovereignty as well. The WHO itself was supposed to give a 4-month notice. To every member, they just ignored it and just plowing ahead. So, and then certain states in the United States are already, legislating against the UN, against the WHO, and against the World Economic Forum. That so there is an awakening going on. Do you see that? In other words, what I'm saying is, where's the hope here? I'm not asking you to create hope unless you see what I'm seeing, but I'm just asking you what you think, because you're knee deep now in an awful lot of the evidence behind all of this. You've quoted numerous voluminous sources in your book, which gives it enormous credibility. It's a very courageous book to write, which gives you an awful lot of credibility, in my opinion. But where do you see it going? Is that too hard a question at this stage to put to you?
No, it's a really good question and a really important question. I think the balance of forces is a lot finer than many people might perceive or understand. One of the things I argue, particularly in chapter 8 of the book, is that although this operation, in my opinion, was planned over the course of at least the preceding 2 decades and perhaps longer, in many ways, it also seemed to have been rolled out ahead of time, in a manner which in many ways was rushed and botched and full of inconsistencies and things not quite hanging together. I have a section called Ruling Class Desperation in chapter 8, in which I cite numerous of these kind of transnational so-called elite figures expressing real worry and concern that things are not going their way. Do you remember Najir Woods at the World Economic Forum saying, we can lead, but if the people won't follow us, we've got a real problem. The people are trusting their elites, as she called them, less and less. So you're right that events since 2020 have really exposed the true power relations in the world in a way that wasn't clearly visible before. And a lot of what I do in the book is to try and just make as clear as possible what those power relations actually look like. Now, it's good to see the kind of green shoots in 2024 that you're describing, and these various mechanisms of and forms of protest and resistance. It was telling also, one of the biggest moments I thought was the Canadian truckers protest in early 2022. And the reason that was important is because it was not online, it was in real life, and it was impossible to hide. So as the convoy passed through and you had thousands of people on every bridge, the level of support was undeniable. And I think that really worried the controllers. And it's interesting that the COVID operation was wound down almost immediately after that. So again, one of the parallels I draw between what's happening today and what was happening in Nazi Germany is the difficulty in knowing how many people are genuinely on board with these agendas. Even the people who shout the loudest for them, you can never really know what they're truly thinking. And a lot of people must know now that there is something very badly wrong about all of this. So one example I sometimes use has to do with the so-called vaccination rate among UK adults with regard to the so-called COVID vaccines. And by July 2022, when most of that rollout had taken place, according to UK Health Security Agency data, 23% of UK adults remained unvaccinated. That's nearly a quarter. That's quite a sizable constituency that had withstood the entire psychological assault on them over the course of the previous 2 years and said no. And in addition, what we know about statistics in the COVID era context is that they're all massaged and manipulated. So if that's the official data, the true proportion is likely to be much higher. I don't know how much higher, but we could easily be talking a third of the population that didn't actually play ball with any of this. Furthermore, every passing day sees more and more people, in inverted commas, waking up, i.e. starting to understand that they've been lied to and viciously abused. And that in itself creates an ever-growing resistance, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. So incrementally over time, the odds are increasingly on our side. So things might not be happening as fast as we would like, but I do think at this stage, as more and more people start to push back against this and stand up and take risks.
Well, another factor I think, which I was detecting, which it's very detectable once you get out and people start talking about this openly. There's a huge level of unresolved trauma because people have been told you can't talk about this. The media won't talk about it. The political establishment won't talk. People aren't even talking about it amongst themselves. There's a huge amount of hurt, and it's akin to talking to somebody who's come forward for the first time to tell you that they've been abused. It's the same psychological process.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most important points that you made in your talk in Cork. That, and I make this point in the introduction to my book, that what has taken place here has been deliberately traumatic. It was the intentional infliction of trauma and lies and many other things. So, in a sense, reading my book is a process of anamnesis. It's about recalling what exactly happened. It's very easy when, as Mary Holland says, anyone who lived through the COVID era essentially will find themselves in a state of PTSD at some level or other. And it's very easy under those circumstances to just want to put it all behind you and blank it out and never think about it again because it was so awful. Now, the problem with that is that it locks victims into the orbit of their abusers, and the abuse can repeat and the cycles can happen again. So one of the reasons for writing the book was precisely to try and remember what happened, to point the finger very concretely at specific individuals, specific events, so that this is documented for the historical record. And it's only really by working through the trauma and everything that was done to us that we can actually move forwards with dealing with the perpetrators of this phenomenal level of psychological abuse, which was nothing short of psychological warfare.
David, just ask you about an area of the book that I'm sure you're taking up again, and I know it's deduction, and that's that. I'm asking this question in the week where AstraZeneca was taken off the market for very rare problems with creating blood clots. There's a lot of people around the world who said they're not very rare, and it's not the only vaccine. There's going to be more information coming out on other vaccines, I'm sure, as all of this kind of peels away. And you might find that as your book comes out, events will start giving it great support. Not, I'm going to say great support, but will validate it. Great support is the wrong term. But you get into an area of the book that I found very uncomfortable. It reminded me of the uncomfortable feeling I had when I first started to look at all of this. I said, oh, God, But you're talking about there's 16 different studies into the actual vaccines themselves, have located geometric patterns inside in the vaccines. They don't know what it is. It's not normal biology, and it looks like it's military level technology inside in the vaccines. I mean, can you just walk? No, that's a big piece of information for people who've even gone through gone through what we've said so far to come to that. I mean, that's absolutely shocking finding, because it raises a completely new vista.
Yes,
Even if you got this far already in understanding it.
it does. Yeah, I mean, again, I kind of put a. I'd advise people to approach this book very carefully, and I make this recommendation in the introduction that it's emotionally it's very difficult. It's a very challenging book to read, and even if you make it through the first 7 chapters, which all deal with means of psychological warfare, that bigger question remains as to what the point of the psychological warfare was and what comes next. So historically, when you look at psychological warfare, it tends to be the prelude to physical warfare. It tends to be designed to weaken populations in advance so that when the real fighting breaks out, they're in a much weaker state, their will to resist has been sapped, and so on. So we might then start to look ahead, as I do in chapter 8, and think, well, what is this fundamentally all about? And I argue that it's a war for technocracy. So technocracy is essentially a form of scientific dictatorship. It's about having scientific management and control over everybody and everything. The potential here for human enslavement is enormous. Now, part of what this can involve, and again, there is extensive military intelligence documentation to support this, is linking up human bodies to an external control network through bio-nano technology. And you can go all the way back to the early 2000s, and they're framing this in terms of a time frame for launching this bio-nano era in the years that they use are 2020, 2025, and 2030, typically. So we know that that's been their intention for a very long period of time. And as you move along and you look at the kinds of breakthroughs that were made, particularly, for example, by a scientist called Charles Lieber, he was able, as early as 2001, to develop what he called a self-assembling computer, a liquid computer. You could kind of pour out the contents of a liquid, and this kind of liquid computer would kind of self-assemble. That was back in 2001. By 2011, he was able to create tiny transistors that were capable of embedding themselves in cells. So here the technology is going into the body, and again, capable of communicating with an external network. And as time goes on, I think there's ever more reason to suspect, based on the evidence, that there is a deeper agenda here to gain not only psychological control over human beings, but possibly neurological control as well, or at least hook them up to this external network. And again, the what that entails, if that's actually achievable, is that you could monitor everybody at all times. You could remotely target them for assassination or torture. I mean, it's really quite gruesome. So with that background in mind, and I'd also encourage viewers and listeners to check out my co-authored 4-part series on transhumanism, which is appearing at the moment in Propaganda in Focus, where we go into this in much greater detail. It's an excellent publication, propagandainfocus.com. And that's all of the kind of the necessary background to this. So then we get to 2020, and we have this operation that's clearly designed to get these injectables into as many people as possible for no sound, moral, or scientific reason. And the levels of coercion and bribery and guilt tripping and all the rest of it were absolutely off the scale. So clearly there's no good public health rationale for this. So what was it really all about? Why go to these lengths? How was it even possible to have so many vials waiting and ready to go in the first place? We're talking billions here. This takes a lot of pre-planning. So the paper that I put out in September 2022 was called "What is in the so-called COVID-19 vaccines? Evidence of a global crime against humanity." Because I was very curious at that point as to what exactly is it that the powers that be are trying to get inside of everybody's bodies. Because I certainly didn't trust this agenda. And it turns out that at that time, I was able to find at least 26 different researchers and research teams from all around the world, 4 different continents, I think 15 or 16 different countries, looking at all of the different manufacturers, working in almost all cases independently of one another. And they all converged on fairly similar findings, which were really quite horrifying, that there are certainly all manner of undisclosed ingredients in the vaccines. And that in and of itself means that there cannot possibly have been proper informed consent when taking them, because clearly there's a lot in there which was not disclosed to the public. And then some of the structures the researchers found shocking. So, for example, hematologists with 30 years of experience of looking at blood were seeing things that they had never seen before in the blood of vaccinated patients. The vials themselves, when just their contents are left under the slide and looked at under a microscope, they produce all kinds of very peculiar structures, often very complex, often involving complex geometric shapes. The doubters like to say that it's just salt crystals or some other naturally occurring kind of crystal, but clearly it isn't, because some of this has been shown to be self-assembling. Some of it has been shown to be EMF responsive. Other studies have used spectroscopy to analyze the chemical components of what's in these vials, and they found all manner of peculiar things, including some quite exotic metals, including antimony, for example, which is highly toxic. So there are, I don't have any answers. I couldn't tell you exactly what is in these shots, but what I do know is that those people who have conducted the relevant research to look at the primary evidence have all converged around fairly similar findings, and those findings are pretty horrifying. And unfortunately, they do make sense when placed in the broader context of this project for an IT bio-nano era. So again, to most people, it just sounds like the stuff of sci-fi. It sounds completely implausible and unbelievable. But what I have tried to do consistently in my work over the last few years is to actually provide the hard evidence in support of these propositions, because these are not conclusions which I wanted to arrive at. And the further you go in this research, the more horrifying it gets, and the scale of the darkness and of the evil becomes increasingly clear the further I pursue these lines of inquiry.
Matthias Desmet quoted Hannah Arendt in 1951 saying that, because she studied all of this back in the day, she said that the 21st century totalitarianism would come. It would be banality of evil, the banality of it. It would be faceless bureaucrats the next time around. And she wrote that halfway through the last century about our present time. I find that very, very interesting. Along with everything you said, I know you're on a tricky wicket. You've mentioned that publicly, so I want to give you a chance to just explain that to people that are listening to you, that know that you're taking on a lot and doing what you're doing, and you do need support.
Okay, so so the situation that I'm now in, my university recently announced that 220 staff would be made redundant. I'm almost certain that will include me. So technically, this announcement was made only 6 days after my book was published. Technically, the two things are not connected. But for reasons that we've already discussed, it's pretty clear to me that maintaining an academic position is actually incompatible with speaking fundamentally the truth in today's society. That's how inverted everything has become. So I essentially now stand to lose my career over this, and for having tried to speak the truth and alert everybody to the great evil which is slowly enveloping our world. The COVID-19 Psychological Operations and War for Technocracy book, I was able to secure...
That book is free online, right?
Open access funding for that book, all of which went... It is, yeah. So all of that went straight to the publisher, but in return, what it means is that for your viewers and listeners, it's free for them to download, and they can legally redistribute it for free. It's licensed under a Creative Commons 4.0 license, so I'd encourage everybody to do that. Try and avoid social media where possible, because it's being heavily shadow banned, of course, on social media. It's getting 1,000 to 2,000 downloads a day at the moment, and hardly any mentions that I can see, at least, on social media. So that book is available for free, and because it's an open access book, I don't actually receive a penny in royalties, fees, commissions, nothing. I don't get anything at all financially from this book. So at this point where I am standing to lose my career over this kind of research, I would strongly encourage readers that if they do download it and they do read it, and if they find something of value, then please do the honest thing and try and give something back, because I really need it at this point.
Well, can I help you there, David? I'm just saying to people that know me and are listening to for the first time, I have David's bank account details. So if you want to send some cash over to David to help him on his way through these very tricky waters, just send me an email to eddie@eddiehobbs.com, and I'll give you I'll show you how to do it. That'll cut through buying coffee for you and all that kind of stuff.
Thanks, Eddie.
Yeah,
well, that's the thing. So I mean, this is the problem. I mean, I do have a buymeacoffee.com/DA Hughes site, but it's it's relatively small. I mean, I'm grateful for any contribution, of course, but I'll need a lot more than coffee. And the other issue as well is how reliable are these payment processors, because they've been known to kind of take money from dissidents in the past, and I'm still to receive my first payouts at the moment from Buy Me a Coffee. So I'm not 100% trusting.
So David, I would say to people, send me an email to eddie@eddiehobbs.com. That'll come directly to me, and I'll get it sorted.
Thanks. That'd be a good bypass. I'm also starting a Substack soon, dhughes.substack.com, so be able to find more of my work there. I've got various papers and the free ebook up on my academia.edu site, which is ulincoln, all one word, ulincoln.academia.edu/David Hughes/papers. And I'm hoping to get my own website off the ground soon as well, which will be www.omni-war.org. So there's various places where you can find me. Now, I just want to reiterate, in addition to kind of showing some financial support for volume 1 of the book that's just been published, my desire and my intention is to complete volume 2. And I can only do that with public support at this stage. So if you do want to see volume 2 of this book, please do try and support my work, because I can't now do it without you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we leave it at that, David. That's. I know. Look, it's a very, very extensive piece of work, and I hope I've given it some flavour for listeners and viewers. And we'll be hearing a lot more from you, I hope, in the very near future. We'll be hearing an awful lot more about the material that you're bringing to public attention, because once it's seen, it can't be unseen. That's where we're at. I think there is a pivot point, and the balance of power is shifting a bit. But we'll see. There's a huge cognitive dissonance out there amongst the mainstream media and the political establishment. None of them want this material made public. Yeah. None of them want to engage in this material, and they're going to continue their shadow banning and censorship for as long as they can hold out. But they can't hold out forever, because the waters are rising rapidly now of data, commentary, evidence coming out from scientists, medical scientists, and people like you throughout the world. It's rising, and it's just going to keep rising, because it's the truth.
And the truth always wins in the end.
That's the plan. That's the plan, David. Listen, great talking to you. Thank you so much for giving the interview. And I'd love to come back and talk to you again which I'm certain about, when volume 2 comes out, and we'll see what that contains.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on, and I'd be very glad to come back anytime.
Thanks, David. Well, if you've enjoyed Counterpoint, please subscribe by clicking the button below. See you next time.